Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR 96.3 HD2 and Sirius XM Channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. The catastrophic loss and damage from Hurricane Helene has caused communities in the Southeast to suffer greatly. Obviously, many of them are still reeling from last week's powerful storm that has left a wide path of death and destruction. More than 130 people are reported dead, hundreds more missing, and millions are still without power and basic supplies. As help begins to trickle in, my guest this evening wants to assure that assistance is equitable and reaching Black communities, which often receive the least recovery support. My guest is Abray Connor, Director of Environmental and Climate Justice for the NAACP. Abray, thank you so much for joining the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Sure thing. Let's talk a little bit about what we already know. Of course, a lot of people are in shelters. We have hundreds of road closures, damaged water systems, long lines for gas where it can be found, power outages, cell phone outages, lack of food. FEMA is already on the ground in some of the most affected areas. And of course, the reality is that no one could have prepared for the kind of storm that we saw here. The NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, says this one was bigger than Katrina. What is the concern from the NAACP about how this storm is going to affect communities of color moving forward?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that question, because to your point, this is a catastrophic disaster. And some of the impact, the way that we're seeing hurricanes, that we're seeing tornadoes, that we're seeing flooding show up is in fact because of decisions that have been made for decades and decades. Because of the concentration of fossil fuels in Black communities, in historically excluded communities, we are seeing the impact of those decisions, because when you have these concentrations of fossil fuels, it makes it more likely to have heating trapped in the air in those areas, in those regions. And so even though places like Florida, Georgia, and places in the global South have been experiencing hurricanes, but because of the decisions to concentrate fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emissions in particular communities, we're going to continue to see more frequent natural disasters and more harmful natural disasters in our communities. And so it's the fact that Hurricane Helene happened at a time where many of these communities had already just experienced rain. They just experienced other natural disasters that had happened. The communities aren't having enough time to rebuild and to think about infrastructure from the last natural disaster that they faced. And so now we are seeing flooding. We're seeing, to your point, power outages. We're concerned about the number of resources being able to reach the right communities. FEMA and other agencies in the past have not necessarily had the best track record of thinking about equity when it comes to the disaster cleanup space. And it's not necessarily something that they aren't thinking about now, but it takes a while to make those kinds of shifts when for decades and decades, FEMA has kind of had a one-size-fits-all approach to disaster recovery, to disaster resiliency efforts. And so now it's about thinking about what are the culturally competent ways to ensure that agencies like FEMA, like HUD, like SBA are actually getting into communities, reaching people, making sure that they're able to get the resources, the individual assistance in a timely manner, that they don't have to actually appeal any decision as it relates to trying to get resources and they're able to actually get that funding right away, that the process isn't arduous, that you don't have people having to search all the internet to try to figure out what resources are actually available from different federal agencies. And so these are just some of the things that we're thinking about. But we're also thinking about the fact that we know that this is not the last hurricane. This is not the last tropical storm. This is not the last tornado that's going to hit these communities. And so how do we work on the infrastructure now so that we can actually have communities that can actually build resiliency into the future?
So it sounds like you are talking about several different points. I would argue, first and foremost, that this hurricane, larger than Katrina, has hit everyone. And so let's talk about first, before we think about where we're going down the road, when you're talking about the allocation of resources and rebuilding, what is the position of the NAACP, particularly from your perspective, on addressing what has just happened and is still happening?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that our position right now is, of course, that resources need to be available now, that there needs to be the agencies, that the entities that have the ability to get resources, to get clean water, to think about ways that you have backup power sources available, that needs to be available now. At the same time, while we're thinking about the investments that need to come into communities now, all of it is part of the same conversation, because we don't have time to necessarily only address what's happening now without also addressing what's likely going to happen in the future. As we saw even with this hurricane, there was a hurricane that passed and then tornadoes came right after. And so it's about, number one, ensuring that we have the resources there, that we have the community groups and organizations coming in to help with the direct services, that the agencies themselves that have the ability to now come in directly into the community, that they're actually ensuring that people have ways to get out of really hazardous and harmful in harm's way, because there is, active flooding that's happening in many communities. And while we're ensuring that people are able to get to safety, while we're ensuring that there's clean water, there's resources that are available, we have to at the same time be thinking about, as people are applying for individual assistance, because now is a time, unfortunately, during the midst of a natural disaster, that people have to start thinking about being able to apply for those resources. And those are decisions that unfortunately have been, set up from years and years of how federal agencies operate. As it relates to being able to actually get the resources that people need later. They have to actually start thinking about that now. And those are policies and decisions that we can continue to think about. What is the best way to ensure that people don't have to think about what, the available investments are going to look like later in the midst of a natural disaster? But unfortunately, the way that is set up is that people have to be thinking about the natural disaster and what the next steps are going to look like at the same time. So right now, one of the things that's really important and that we have continued to push is for agencies to think about what that actually means for the communities that are suffering in that moment. Should they have to be applying for individual assistance in the midst of a disaster? Should there be a shorter timeline so that they can actually focus on what's needed at that moment, as opposed to also focusing on the resources that they're going to need 3, 6, 9 months down the line in the midst of the natural disaster? We also have to ensure that our state government, that they are actually prioritizing the communities who have been the hardest hit, not just by this hurricane, but also the number of infrastructure and natural disasters that have hit communities in the global South.
So let's talk geography first, because we look at what is happening right now in Asheville, which is along the Appalachian Trail, the mountain range, western North Carolina. It is, again, it's mountainous, it's rural. The governor of North Carolina said yesterday that there was no way that they possibly believed they could have anticipated something like this. The Washington Post reporting today that, to your point, that region of western North Carolina does not necessarily have the natural disaster evacuation routes. We are talking rural, small towns. This is not Charlotte. This is not Raleigh. This is not even, Winston-Salem, for example. And so many of these places have been wiped out. So is it certainly the federal government, if it were more forward looking, could say that places like Asheville and even more nationally, rural communities should have some kind of safety plan. But you also don't know what you don't know. You can't anticipate a Helene. You couldn't have really anticipated a Hurricane Andrew. You could not have anticipated a Katrina and the impact when they happen. So let me make sure that I understand your point. We don't know what's happening next, but we do have information that says this stuff is going to happen again. And so are you suggesting that in the wake of a Hurricane Helene, that the government needs to develop a policy that would better address some of the issues that they're now dealing with today?
Yeah. I think, and kind of to that point, I actually think that we could have predicted some of the impact of what this was going to look like. So we had the 5th National Climate Assessment that actually showed that Black communities were more likely to face flooding than any other community. We've had this information that it didn't just come out yesterday. So we've had this information for a little bit of time. And so to know that Black communities are more likely to experience flooding, this is information in the federal government, this is information that state governments, that governors also have had access to as well. We saw the impact of, for example, in Rolling Fork, and that was not just a few months ago. It's been a little bit of time since the tornadoes hit Rolling Fork, which is a predominantly Black, rural, remote community. Granted, is in Mississippi, but they faced similar issues in trying to actually get emergency management and volunteer efforts to that community. There are certain Congress members who have been pushing for there to be more infrastructure, to have a better policy and plans in place for some time. Congressman Benny Thompson, for example, is one of those members of Congress who has said we need to actually have plans in place for remote rural communities, particularly those that tend to have Black and other people of color, historically excluded communities there, because they're doubly facing a number of the infrastructure issues that come up when it comes to natural disasters. So we did,
hold on, let me stop you one moment, because I do have to take a break. Please do not forget your point. I'll let you continue on the other side. We are going to take a really quick break as always, but don't forget you can hear this and every edition of the Daily Drum Insight segment via podcast on WHUR.com. The original Quiet Storm is next on WHUR. I'm Harold Fisher. This conversation continues on Sirius XM channel 141 in just a few seconds. Welcome back to the Daily Drum on Sirius XM channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. We continue our conversation about disaster recovery from Hurricane Helene for affected Black communities. My guest is Aubrey Connor. She is the Director of Environmental and Climate Justice for the NAACP. Aubrey, before the break, you were talking about possible, legislation, as well as national or congressional legislation, as well as, the federal government, specifically FEMA, making plans for the next Helene, particularly as it relates to equity and recovery for Black communities. Please continue your point.
Yeah. And the point is that while we may not have been able to predict every single nuance of Helene, we could have predicted that if we didn't have a plan for remote and rural communities, particularly those who have more Black and other people of color, people from historically excluded communities, that this was going to happen. We saw this in Rolling Fork. We saw this with the efforts to try to get people into Rolling Fork and into the surrounding areas there. They faced similar issues, trying to find hotels, trying to get people evacuated, trying to figure out where those individuals were going to be able to stay, and then also have volunteers come in. So this is not necessarily the first time that federal agencies have had to face trying to get into remote communities that haven't had built out infrastructure. However, this is something that we're going to see more regularly and in a more impactful way in many places that have already suffered a number of infrastructure, have had disinvestment in their infrastructure over a number of decades. And so now is the time, because we are seeing this pattern. We do have the information from the 5th National Climate Assessment that says, to your point, we're all experiencing this climate catastrophe, but that Black communities are more likely to experience flooding. So what are the investments that, from a congressional kind of lens, from a state government who actually decides where to allocate those funds once they actually get them from the federal government? Where are those funds actually going? Are we actually investing into infrastructure, into the communities that we know are more likely going to face the impacts of a Hurricane Helene or the next unfortunate disaster that comes to their communities?
So two things again, if we talk about Hurricane Helene, even if what you're suggesting is correct, the other thing, two things can be true at the same time: that marginalized communities of color, often get the least amount of assistance historically. But in the case of Helene, when you're talking about Asheville, North Carolina, Western North Carolina, that area has a Black population of 4%. So, and everyone is hurting. Everyone has been hit. And so is the argument for rural communities or for Black communities?
I don't think that there is a either or. I think it's a both and, in recognizing that when we center, unfortunately, we have to continue to center race, because the solutions that will likely help Black communities, they will also help other communities that also need that infrastructure investment as well. And so this isn't to say that other communities shouldn't be able to benefit from the solutions that come from really centering environmental justice with a race forward kind of perspective, but is recognizing that the impacts that typically happen in Black communities or historically excluded communities, so that doesn't necessarily mean just Black communities, but it's the communities that haven't necessarily always seen the most investment as it relates to infrastructure, as it relates to funding that funnels through the state to their community, that those are the places where we need to start and think about the most equitable solutions. Because once we center those communities, then that's going to have a domino effect for all of us, for all communities. And so it's not necessarily to say that there's going to be only the communities that have large populations of Black people are going to be impacted by a hurricane. Unfortunately, because of the decisions that have been made to have an over reliance on fossil fuels, we're all going to continue to experience the impact of hurricanes, of torrential rain, of flooding. However, we also know that there are disproportionate impacts by and large on communities based on race. There was a report that was done back in the 1980s, Toxic Waste and Race, and it demonstrated that more likely, just no matter what the other factors were, it could be income, it could be region, that race was the predominant factor as it related to where toxic waste incinerators, which typically house large concentrations of greenhouse gas emissions, that race was the number one factor of where these plants were located. They did the same study 20 years later, and you would have thought that because this information was available, that there were fewer plants that were in those communities, but unfortunately they saw an increase. And so if we know that the large kind of concentrations of greenhouse gas emissions are more likely to be in communities of color, are more likely to be in Black communities, then it only logically makes sense that by and large, these kinds of natural disasters are going to hit Black communities and communities of color at higher rates. But we're all going to experience the impact of natural disasters, because unfortunately, it's not like you can just have fossil fuels concentrated only in those areas. It's going to be more likely in those areas, it's going to be disproportionate in those areas, but we're all going to be experiencing the impact of the climate catastrophe that we're in.
Okay, so help me understand this, because I'm trying to make sure that we're not conflating a six-state natural disaster with our dependence on fossil fuels in Black communities. So I'm trying to make sure that I'm hearing you correctly, because if you have uh, Black communities in, let's say, Central Florida, where you're from, okay, what does that have to do with hurricane season that we see every single year? And so help me understand that point.
So global warming,
Yeah.
which is what actually leads to us having more frequent, or like a a larger hurricane that impacts what, for example, these natural disasters that we're likely to see every single year, what that looks like. So the concentration of greenhouse gas emissions in a particular city, in a particular neighborhood, means that in the atmosphere in that area, there's more likely to be more trapping of heat, which is the global warming in that particular place. So those particular places are going to have atmospheric impact, the impact of the atmosphere having more global warming in that region, in that area, means that the disasters are going to actually be worse there. So we actually have to talk about our reliance on fossil fuels as we're also talking about natural disasters, because the decisions that people are making on the ground to have a reliance on fossil fuels, to have emissions from those fossil fuels in our communities, directly impacts the atmosphere in those communities as well. And therefore, when a natural disaster comes through, it is going to have a bigger impact on the communities that have more fossil fuels, that have a larger carbon footprint. Not to say that the people there are actually causing it, but unfortunately, because of those decisions, this is why we're seeing it more frequently in Black communities, in communities of color, because of those decisions around fossil fuels to heavily concentrate them in those communities. And again, I want to go back to the point that the National Climate Assessment, which is a government sanctioned report that highlights, yes, to the point that I made earlier, we're all experiencing this climate emergency, but that Black communities are more likely to face flooding. And this is consistent with the points that I'm making around the fact that we're all experiencing the climate emergency, but that we're seeing, for example, Black communities who are going to be more likely to face flooding, to face the impacts of a hurricane or a tornado. To your point, I grew up in Central Florida. I grew up in a place where we saw hurricanes regularly. With that being said, now when there's a hurricane that hits, there's also tornadoes. Tornadoes are not typical in Florida, but we are now seeing more tornadoes in Central Florida, which is not a typical thing. And also the amount of rain, it doesn't take as much rain for a community to have infrastructure collapse because of the frequency of the natural disasters that are hitting.
So I would push back on what you just said, because one of the reasons why, and this is certainly anecdotally speaking, um, another 2 points. So when you're talking about large cities, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Miami, uh, Tampa, which is, of course, as you know, west of Lakeland, where you're from. Yes, big cities, whether they are predominantly Black or not, they have a huge reliance. They have a huge carbon. They have a huge carbon footprint, and so I'm not. I'm not sure that that is an easy sell when you're talking about, communities that may be more rural, have a smaller population. I mean, that I would just say that issue may be debatable, but
But
the
I
other.
do have the numbers for that though. So I
Okay, yeah,
can
because
actually, yeah, because
yeah,
Polk
because I
County
mean, when you
actually
talk
has the
about.
largest, Polk County has the largest concentration of large facilities with greenhouse gas emissions in the state. And as a Floridian, I can tell you that Polk County is not an urban community at all. It is more rural. We grew up with well water. I did not grow up in an urban area. I grew up around a bunch of phosphate plants and mining that happens very frequently in Florida. Miami actually has fewer emissions than Polk County. Now, there are intentional decisions that led to a place that is more rural, a place that is not necessarily as heavily concentrated, but it's heavily concentrated by certain demographics and certain types of individuals in those communities, many small cities, many communities where the income level for many of the kind of smaller communities within Polk County is not as high. That the fact that Polk County actually has a higher concentration of those greenhouse gas emissions than Miami, I think does actually go to the point that I was trying to make earlier. And it also, you can see that consistently in other places in the global South as well. It's not to say that this is about rural versus urban, but it goes to my earlier point, which is around where the likelihood of these incinerators are to be placed. That is not necessarily, the numbers are there. The data actually does support the points that I'm making. And we're also seeing that data supported by NOAA, which you mentioned earlier, and by the EPA, by the National Climate Assessment, showing what that overlay looks like. We also saw this same kind of trend first in California when they did CalEnviroScreen, which was replicated by Health and Human Services at a federal level to kind of look at where the environmental hazards were across the state of California and where you had higher populations and concentrations of people of color. And you could see the overlay across the entire state of California to show that they were more likely to have environmental hazards and they were more likely to experience certain natural disasters based on race. When HHS did a similar kind of overlay, when they looked at certain demographics and they looked at the overlay of where there were hazards across the country, you could see similar patterns. So I think that while, of course, there are always going to be people who are going to be able to pull out singular cases, we're looking at patterns, and we're looking at where are the patterns more likely to happen, and the disinvestment, the more likely that a community has faced disinvestment for decades and potentially centuries, the more likely that they're going to face infrastructure issues when it comes to natural disasters, the more likely that they're going to likely face issues with the impact of natural disasters hitting their communities as well.
Now, that I can agree with, because if you are living in a marginalized community with limited resources, as opposed to, and we saw this during Hurricane Katrina, those who could get out got out. Those who could not get out suffered. And just on a more personal note, I was in Miami, specifically Homestead, in 1992, 2 days after Hurricane Andrew, which at that time was one of the worst hurricane disasters in modern American history. And Hurricane Andrew did not differentiate between who got hit. Everybody suffered severely. And I would say, and we saw this during Hurricane Katrina, we saw this during Hurricane Andrew. Obviously, we're seeing this now, but I'm not sure that hurricanes and tornadoes are mutually exclusive. Though and while climate change certainly may impact the severity of the natural disasters that we're seeing, it, as it relates to hurricanes, in my experience covering them, that there's always the likelihood that there is going to be a possible tornado within this cauldron of disaster called a hurricane. That being said, to the original point, what would an infrastructure change, a revamp, look like moving forward? With what is it that you believe can be learned from a Hurricane Helene that the federal government has not necessarily learned from an Andrew or a Rolling Fork or Hurricane Katrina? What needs to change?
I think that actually, I think we do agree with the fact that there is always going to be a likelihood that there will be there's a domino effect of other natural disasters that can come from a natural disaster. The point that, unfortunately, that the place and time that we're living in now is the frequency and the severity. And so I just want to make sure I'm being crystal clear. Many of these communities have had hurricanes. They've had tornadoes. Sometimes it's very unlikely that the severity of, for example, a tornado or a tropical storm will hit that community, because it's like, yes, during hurricane season, there's likely going to be some kind of hurricane or some kind of tropical storm or some type of rain that hits many of these communities. The severity and the frequency is where we're going to run into trouble if we don't change our current practices. And so this takes me back to the earlier point that I was making around the infrastructure fixes that have to happen pretty much in real time when a community is facing a natural disaster, because the frequency and the severity of what the next natural disaster that's likely going to hit that community is going to look like means that there's not going to be necessarily as much time in between one hurricane and potentially the next hurricane, or potentially the next tropical storm, or just rainfall. Once a community, for example, feels the impacts of a very severe hurricane or very severe flooding or very severe tornado, typically what has happened in the past is there's at least enough time for the ground to dry out a little bit, so that people can think about what rebuilding infrastructure can look like in that time. And then also for people to kind of start to, rebuild their lives, to start doing everyday things so they can think about applying for individual assistance, to have the opportunity to have electricity, to have energy sources so that they can actually use their cell phones or use their computers or figure out how to get to a place where they can fill out those forms. But we're in a time now where the infrastructure kind of problems, to your earlier point, in rural communities, in remote communities, those kinds of pathways have to be basically considered right now. So the federal investments to ensure that the communities that are more remote, that they have the ability to have access to those investments, making sure that unfortunately there aren't any potential stopgaps of them being able to access those investments, those federal dollars that typically, again, go to the state. And the state typically makes a lot of those decisions as to where the money goes, as to which communities get prioritized. And so if those communities have not been prioritized, then it's just kind of an oh well type of situation. And so there has to be innovative ways to ensure that we're not waiting on, for example, states who may not have prioritized those communities. How can the federal government offer assistance more directly to those communities, and not just in the wake of disaster, but using those opportunities to actually build the resilience while they're there? There also has to be some fixes to, there's some statutes and some acts that make it really challenging for a local community to be able to reach out to FEMA or to the federal government when they know that a disaster is coming or after a disaster has ended. And so there has to be some fixes to, for example, the Stafford Act, to ensure that communities are able to actually access the federal government if they know that these disasters are more likely to come. Another thing that we see oftentimes is that local communities, especially in rural and more remote places, they may not actually have the resources to have funded emergency managers in each of their communities. And so oftentimes these positions are volunteer, especially in smaller places. And so it's about ensuring that the resources are there for them to have the proper staffing so they can prepare for the next natural disaster that's likely going to hit their community.
So on that particular point, if it's not there, what does it look like to put it there in some of the more remote communities, short of having someone who works at the local post office? Because as you know, in rural communities, outside of a county seat, that the only federal government building is the post office. And I'm talking really, really small rural communities. But even as it relates to the county seat, there still may not be a federal courthouse. So what would that look like?
I think that one of the things that has, been somewhat of an issue when it comes to thinking about disaster resiliency is coming up with this kind of one size fits all kind of plan for all communities. And I think that one of the really important things that we've learned, especially in what we're seeing with Hurricane Helene, is that we actually need to hear from the communities about what it is that they need. So for example, you may have communities who are like, well, we understand that there's an issue, but we don't have the money to actually build shelters. We have a makeshift shelter that we've developed, and it doesn't actually meet any kind of code or anything like that, but it's the best that they can do with the resources that are available to them. And so in some communities, that may be the number one priority, is to actually have shelters that people can actually utilize if it comes to that, when the issues come up. It means having an all government approach. So for example, it is FEMA, but it's HUD, it's the Department of Education, it's SBA, it's having all these agencies work together to ensure that resources are actually flowing to the right places when a community says, this is, what it is that we need. It's ensuring that the alert types of systems are actually functioning in those communities. We know that in some communities, they're not functioning properly, and that isn't necessarily the priority because they're focused on a number of other issues that they have to deal with, like fixing their roads. Do we have housing for people? Do we have a hospital or a community health center for people to go to? Is the water treatment plant or water infrastructure even up to par? And so it's ensuring that we're actually hearing from the communities themselves as to what is kind of the number one priority, starting there, and then building out kind of what are just the high level things that many other communities that it may be easier for them to access resources, or at least get to a place to access resources that they have available for them.
I've got about a minute left, and I did want to ask you, for those people who are watching the after effects of Hurricane Helene and they want to help, do you have a suggestion as to where they may want to donate their time or financial resources? What do you suggest?
Well, as someone who works for the NAACP, I'm always going to encourage people to join NAACP, our state conferences, our branches.
No, I'm talking about right now.
Yeah,
today.
on the ground.
Yeah.
On the ground, talking with community members, ensuring that they're gathering stories so that information cycle is happening to get the information to the federal policymakers who need to understand what's actually happening right now. Of course, there are a number of other entities. We work closely with the Red Cross, for example. There's United Way. There are other places where people can also volunteer their time and efforts. But of course, as someone who works for NAACP, I'm always going to highlight that this is a membership-based organization that allows for people to actually share their stories so that we can better understand where those gaps exist and how we can actually fix the problems.
Aubrey Connor, Director of Environmental and Climate Justice for the NAACP. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That is the Daily Drum for this Tuesday, October 1st. I'm Harold Fisher. Good night.